This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hi everyone, let's start a session. So today what we are going to talk about, we are going to talk about special case connectors. We'll talk about scheduling our task and custom scheduling. Then we'll discuss about some special tasks that we should be aware of. Finally, we will discuss about aggregation strategies and how to improve performance. We'll also talk about how to manually correlate. So we'll also discuss on correlation. And finally, we'll talk about rules, task, and SailPoint API. So this is what we have planned for today. And this will end our module 1. And after that, we will be starting with our module 2. That will be around policies and risk, the compliance module. So let us start. In special case connectors, the first connector that we will talk about. So what are special case connectors? These are connectors that are mostly targeted towards native application. So these are connectors that are mostly targeted towards native application. So native applications are generally old applications that you will have. Let me see if, okay. So native applications are generally old applications in your environment. Generally, these are applications that are legacy applications. So when we are dealing with legacy applications, we could leverage these special case connectors in SailPoint. We have two special case connectors. The first is logical connector that we are going to talk about. And second connector that we are going to talk about is a special case of delimited file or JDBC. This is a multiplex connector. So these are two connectors we will discuss. So first we will talk about what are logical applications in SailPoint and how we can configure a logical application in our environment. So logical application is not a new application. It is a subset of already configured application on SailPoint platform. So subset of already configured application. Now the use case over here is whenever you want subsets to be created in your environment, you could leverage logical application. So what logical application will do, it will create a subset of already configured application. There are two approaches that we could use over here. So first is called combining or composite, and second is called subdividing. As I mentioned that it is not a new application, totally new application. It is a subset of already configured application. And the use case over here is pretty simple. So for example, let's say you onboarded LDAP application. So you have onboarded one LDAP application, and now your requirement is that out of this LDAP application that you have onboarded, for specific groups, for specific admin groups, you want that to be represented as a separate application. Now, why separate application? Because again, when you are launching your compliance module, working with things like certifications, working with things like risk modeling, this could be, so all these users that qualify in this admin group will be represented as a separate application, so can help you manage better. So in this case, our use case is that let's say we have a LDAP application already onboarded in SailPoint. From this, we now want to create a new logical application, and this logical application will only contain users that are part of some specific admin groups on LDAP. So in this case, I can create a logical application. So logical application entirely, it is a subset of already configured application, can be one application or can be multiple applications. So can be a single application or can be, please go on mute if you're not speaking, thank you. So can be one application or can be multiple applications. So either I could create this subset from a single application or from multiple applications that I have already onboarded. So what is combining or composite? Combining is composite where I'm saying that I will define a logical entity A. So I'm defining a logical entity A, and I'm saying access to this logical entity will be defined by if a user is present on application X, if the user is having specific access on application Y and application Z, considering that application X, Y, and Z are already onboarded. So application X, Y, and Z are already onboarded into SailPoint. So they are already connected. So in this case, what I'm doing, I'm combining access of different application to arrive at access of my logical entity, considering these are already onboarded or connected to SailPoint. So I am leveraging a combining or a composite approach. Then we have this subdividing approach. In subdividing, generally what happens is, if I'm saying that I have this logical entity A, I'm saying access to this application is controlled by another application. Let's say LDAP or AD. There are many applications in your enterprise for which access could be controlled through these directory applications. So access is controlled through another application. I'm saying application X. If the user is part of specific groups on application X, then he will have access to my logical entity A. So in this case, what I'm exactly doing, I'm subdividing my access. We are subdividing access on a particular application to arrive at the access needed to access our logical entity. So subdividing is an approach where we could subdivide our application access to arrive at what access is needed to access our logical entity or to be part of our logical entity. So these are the two approaches. And why logical applications? See, the main reason of creating logical application is for compliance. So once we create a logical application, whatever data that qualifies will be part of this logical application. So all my data would be part of this logical application, and I could leverage it in my compliance module like policies, like certifications. So help me automate those processes by treating the data inside a logical application. The disadvantage of logical applications is now they have been replaced by an advanced model called RBAC. So role-based access control is an advanced model that have replaced logical application. Because whenever you do compliance, you cannot keep on creating new applications in your environment. So RBAC has replaced logical application because it is more scalable. And second reason is that when we are talking about RBAC, role-based access control, it could leverage existing connector pathways. So it could use your existing connector pathways for provisioning. Specifically for provisioning, it is easy when you are dealing with roles, but in case of logical applications, you will have to write your own provisioning rules. So provisioning rules are required that makes leveraging logical applications more difficult in this case. So you would rather use RBAC in case of normal applications rather than going for logical. So logicals will generally be used when you are dealing with old applications in your environment, which does not allow much customization of data. So in that case, you will use logical applications. So these are some use cases over here. Multiple separate credentials required for application access. So since multiple application access is required, in this case, we are using combining approach or composite approach. Application access data not recorded in application controlled through group membership on another application. So we are leveraging subdividing over here. What is the advantage of logical application? It simplifies searches, certification, etc. by treating these special types of applications as logical entity. So this is the use case of combining. So over here, we are saying that this is the logical entity we would like to create. And if a user has to be part of this logical entity, it should be present on application A, application B, application C, considering these are already onboarded onto SailPoint. So in this case, application is defined by web application access, mainframe application access, and SQL database access. So we could leverage a combining approach. This is subdividing. Access to web application is managed through Active Directory group membership. So we could leverage a subdividing approach to arrive at the access needed for logical entity. So as I mentioned, roles provide an alternative to logical applications. Roles are more scalable over large volumes. You cannot keep on adding applications into your environment. And for provisioning activities, roles leverage existing connector pathways. In case of logicals, they are supported by manually writing these provisioning rules. For provisioning, what is provisioning? When you would like to send data back to target application. Now, another important point of logical application is, since they are a subset of already defined application, you will not define correlation over here. So correlation of parent application is leveraged, is used. So correlation of parent application is used over here. So we are going to create a logical application based on an application that we onboarded earlier. So we have onboarded an application track, and this was a JDBC connector, and we had a SQL database over here. So now what I want to do is I would like to create a logical application from this particular target application. So this is what I'm targeting over here. On this application that I've onboarded, what I had over here is we had an attribute called capability, which was my managed entitlement attribute. So on my schema, this was my managed entitlement attribute. So I would like to now create a logical application for users that are present on track with the specific capability. And that capability is input. So I'm saying all the users that are present on track having capability equal to input should be part of my logical application. So my logical application, I will end up having users that are having this particular capability on my track application. This is what I want to aim over here. This is what I would like to create. Let us see the schema of our application first. So I'm going to application definition. First, we will look at our base application, that is track. So this is one of the application we have onboarded in past. And if I look at this application, if I go to configuration, application schema. So if I go to configuration application schema, on this application, I have an attribute, my entitlement managed attribute, that is capability over here in this application schema. So this is my application schema. If I go down, this is my managed entitlement attribute. So this is the attribute storing permission information on this target application capability. If I go to intelligence, advanced analytics, over here, I could see the different entitlement values over here, leveraging the entitlement filter. So I will go down. Over here, we have entitlement filters available. So I'm selecting my application track. Now the attribute that is carrying my permission information is capability, and these are the unique values it can have: input, reject, approve, and super. So I'm saying all the users holding input capability should be part of my new logical entity that I would create. So my first precondition is already met, that is track is already onboarded onto SailPoint. So in this case, my parent application is already onboarded, and I would like to leverage my subdividing approach. So we'll go to application, application definition, add new application over here. In this case, we get a dedicated connector, and this dedicated connector that we will get is called logical application. So we have a dedicated connector in this case. So logical application track, I'm saying owner is SP admin. Application type will select our logical application. So you're selecting logical, and you can see in the tab we have no tab available for correlation. So it will leverage the correlation of your parent application since it is a subset of already defined application on your platform. So I will go to configuration. In configuration, the first thing that you have to add is a base tier or primary tier. You can add as many applications as you want. If you're leveraging a multiplex or a composite approach, if you're leveraging a subdividing approach, you could leverage over here in this case a single application. So for example, I'm selecting application track, add tier. So this is already onboarded application that I'm leveraging over here, track. Now over here, I could add more applications that I've onboarded. If in case I would like to go for a composite approach, I could add more applications over here. Right now, I'm adding only track application. I can go ahead and say add attribute. So this is my primary tier. I'm saying this is my primary tier. In track, these are the attributes available. Now I wanted to configure capability equal to input to be part of my logical application. So I'm selecting capability, and these are the available values. I'm saying only input capability I would like to be part of this logical entity that I'm creating. Only those users having input capability on track should be part of this logical entity. If I want, I could add more attributes and I could group them in and or condition. So this is what we have already discussed. I could add either multiple applications, or of the same applications, I could add multiple attributes. So for example, I could do again capability input or capability super. So I could group them in or condition. So I could also group them in or condition over here. So in this case, now it will look for this particular group, this particular condition set. Right now, we want to stick with a single condition, that capability should be equal to input. Going to schema over here, when we go to schema, again, we have discover schema attributes available. So when I go ahead and click on discover schema attributes, everything would be discovered from my parent application. So this is my parent application. This is my parent application schema. So when I say discover attributes, all my parent application schema is brought into my logical application. If I have more than one application, my application schema of more than one application would be discovered and would be brought in. So you could see the source over here, source attribute ID from track, source attribute username from track, and so on. And this is my entitlement managed and multi-valued attribute, again picked from my parent application schema. So this picked from my parent application schema. I can go ahead and define my identity and display attribute. So I'm making it as my identity attribute and this as my display attribute. Again, native object type is pre-populated by default. It is set to account. So in this case, what we have done, we have specified a condition set where we are using a already configured application, saying that if on the already configured application, a particular value, a particular capability value is there, those users will be part of this logical entity. I will go ahead and save this application. And further, I will go ahead and run my aggregation task now. So I will go to setup, task, account aggregation task. I'm selecting my application over here, logical application track, and I will go ahead and say detect deleted accounts. Now we're not selecting disable optimization of unchanged accounts since we only want to do a targeted read of users having input capability on our target application. And I will go ahead and execute this particular task. So I will go ahead and execute this particular task. So aggregate logical application. Remember, we have not defined any correlation in this case, and it is leveraging the correlation of parent application, that is track application. And when I was doing discover schema as well, it was using the schema of my parent application. So this is logical application track. Now when I go to application definition, after the task is complete, when I go to logical application track, we'll go to accounts. So now all these users are the ones that are holding input capability on track. So for example, James Smith. If I open this user James Smith, identity warehouse. So James Smith over here. And when I go to application accounts, I could see a new logical entity link getting created. And over here, I know that this is the user holding input capability on track. So this was the logic of creating our logical application in this case. So this was our base application or authoritative application, and leveraging my parent application definition, this is getting linked to my original cube. So if I go over here, back, go to track, which is my parent application, go to accounts. Now users can have different capabilities on track. Like in this case, Aaron is holding different 4 capabilities on track. Adam is only holding input capability. So all the users with input capability are now part of this logical entity. All these users are the ones holding input capability on track application. So now what is the advantage over here? Now the advantage is, now say I would like to launch a new policy, and this policy is for users holding input access, input capability on track. So I have a logical application that I could directly target. So logical application is being used over here for segregation to create a logical entity which I could use in my compliance module. So like over here, what we have done, we have divided our data of a parent application into a logical entity, logical application, and this now only contains users holding a particular access on track. Similar thing I could have done using my composite or combining approach, where I could have pulled all users with, let's say, users that are part of admin group in Prism application holding input capability on track. So all those users could have been part of my logical entity. So we could either use a combining approach, or like in our case, we were subdividing our application access to arrive at a logical entity. So in this case, what we are doing, we are creating a logical unit out of already existing application, so that this logical entity that we are creating could be used in our compliance module. So this was the use case of our logical application. So question on the chat window is, how does it know the parent application? So in our application over here, we were adding a primary tier. So that primary tier is our application that we would like to leverage. So when we were configuring this application, when I go to configuration, over here we were adding this application that it has to leverage. And this is the application schema that was being pulled in over here. So you have to specify that in your application configuration of your logical application, which particular applications or application it is based on. You would be specifying that in your enter an application over here. Question on the chat window is, so the logical application is not used for account provisioning, it is mainly used for compliance. It is leveraged for provisioning as well. So what you have is, you have a logical entity. So this logical entity you could control anywhere in compliance. The major reason is compliance, but as I mentioned that in this case provisioning is more difficult compared to roles, because you will have to write your provisioning rules. So provisioning can happen in logical application as well, but in this case you will have to write dedicated provisioning rules, unlike RBAC. So when I define roles, roles could leverage or use the application that they are based on. So they could use the application provisioning pathways. But in this case, if I'm creating a logical application, it cannot use the provisioning rules I have written in my parent application. I will have to write new rules. So in logical application, it is only supported. You will have to write your own provisioning rules for this application. So even in provisioning, even in compliance module, you would be provisioning. For example, let's say if there is a policy violation, you would revoke access. revoking access on target application. So this is a provisioning activity. So compliance is, again, compliance. To maintain compliance, you will have to trigger provisioning actions. So those provisioning actions are removing, let's say, removing access on target application if there's a violation. So logical applications does support provisioning activity, but you will have to write your dedicated provisioning rules in this case. So just like any other application, you will have your provisioning rules over here as well. So you can configure your provisioning rules that we'll talk about in our provisioning section. So all those could be configured over here. Dedicated provisioning rules could be configured. So over here, we could configure a provisioning rule if I want. So this was our logical application. We have created a logical entity out of a already onboarded application. The next connector that we are going to discuss is a multiplex connector. Now, what is the use case of a multiplex connector? When we are configuring a multiplex connector, the use case over here is that we have a single feed coming in. The single feed could be a single feed file, or the data is stored in a single staging table. So in this case, multiple applications, I'm talking about multiple applications, either multiple applications are giving you a single feed file. So rather than giving you multiple feed files, they're pushing the data to a single feed file or to a single staging table. And the use case is that from that single feed, we end up creating multiple targeted applications in SailPoint. So this is a requirement that we have a single feed file, either a single feed file extract of multiple applications, or multiple applications are pushing data to a single staging table. And from there, we would like to create multiple targeted applications in SailPoint. So this is our requirement. Now again, where this connector is being leveraged or used in case of legacy applications. So when you have legacy or old applications in your environment, which can give you a combined extract or push data to a single staging table, we would be leveraging a multiplex connector. We don't have a dedicated connector in this case. It is a special use case of delimited file or JDBC connector that we have used in the past. And the only difference would be that in this case, you would be using rules like build map rule, or customization rule. That is the only difference. We would be using build map rule or customization rule in this case in order to segregate the data as we are reading in. So what is multiplex application? Automatically create multiple application based on a single data feed, primarily used with pre-existing entitlement repositories which contain multiple applications. So in this case, multiple applications are pushing data to the same repository, from where when we aggregate the data, we want to create multiple targeted applications. Single data feed containing user entitlements for multiple applications, application definition for repository, use build map or customization rule, and this is important, to set IQ source application. So this is an attribute that should be present, and this is the attribute that will be set leveraging the build map or customization rule. So used to pass records into separate multiplexed applications. And this is the design. So in this case, multiple applications are pushing data to the same repository. As we read data over here, we are applying a customization or build map rule to create multiplexed targeted application as the data is being read. Again, the focus over here is on creating multiplexed targeted applications. So now these are again multiplex targeted logical applications that we are trying to create. So rather than creating one single master application, we are creating over here multiplexed targeted application as we read the data from our single source, a single feed file or a single staging table. That is the use case. So whenever you have legacy applications in your environment, which are pushing data to the same staging table or giving you a single extract, you could leverage this multiplex application to segregate the data and create new applications in your environment. So let us look at the feed file that we are having. So I'm going to implement a training data, and this is multiplex app.csv. So in this case, you could see that this is a feed file like any other normal feed file that we have aggregated. Now over here, we have application over here. So some of the data belongs to a particular application, some data belongs to some other application. Then the data over here is from multiple applications. So our use case over here is, as we configure this application, as we onboard this application, rather than creating one master application, I would like to read these accounts, read these details over here, and create multiple targeted applications. So one application for over here, let's say account pay, one for account receive, one for shipping men, expense rep, and so on. So data over here is from multiple applications. And I have this application data tag over here available as a column attribute. So we should be aware of two important things over here. As mentioned that leveraging this rule, we would be setting this IQ source application. So using build map or customization rule, we will set this IQ source application and parse our data into multiplexed applications. So let us do that. Let us create this application and create our rule. In this case also, you will have a base application, and from that base application, you will create multiplex targeted application. So this is my base application I'm creating. Look at the connector type. It is delimited file. We do not have a dedicated connector called multiplex connector. So I'm leveraging a delimited file connector. Going to configuration over here. I'm giving my file path. So this is my file path where my multiplex app.csv is located. Again, file transport is local. File has column header on the first line. So nothing different. Delimiter is comma. Parsing type is delimited. Going to schema. Again, we are doing discover schema attributes. It brings in all these attributes into my application schema. And over here, our employee ID is identity attribute, full name is display attribute. So till now, the things are similar, like we have onboarded multiple delimited applications. Now going to rules, Either we could use a customization rule, which is an aggregation rule, or we could leverage a build map rule, which is a connector rule. The difference is, the difference between these two rules is build map rule builds a map representation of data. So it builds a map representation of delimited file data and can be used for any customizations. It is a iterative rule. Iterative rule, it runs for every line. It will run for every line. So if you are aggregating from a large feed file, it is not recommended that you go ahead with build map rule. We could also use a customization rule. Now this customization rule works on resource objects, modification of these resource objects, and customize these resource objects according to our requirement. So if I go ahead and look at the build map rule or the customization rule, this is the build map rule we are writing. In this build map rule, again, we are using two things, IQ source application and IQ multiplexed identity. So you should understand what is this IQ source application and IQ multiplex identity. So an application is treated as multiplexing application by identity IQ when the source objects representing its accounts contains a reserved attribute called IQ source application. So usually the resource objects contains a second reserved word called IQ multiplex identity. So in my resource object, I will find this IQ source application and IQ multiplex identity. Now IQ source application, what is this IQ source application? It will tell the aggregator that the actually account belongs to which application. So this IQ source application will tell the aggregator to which particular application this account belongs. So this is being used for iteration. So this is what we mentioned over here, that this is being used for iteration over here. So used to parse the records into separate multiplexed applications. If the IQ source application does not already exist, it is automatically created during the aggregation process. The application schema for the new application will match the schema of the account if it is created to support. This attribute is required for multiplexing application data to be passed into appropriate multiplexed application account. So in simple terms, this attribute is leverage is used so that the aggregator knows to which application this account belongs. The second reserved word over here is IQ multiplexed identity. This is for correlation so that the aggregator over here does not have to do correlation again and again. So it is used by the aggregation process to determine whether the current record belongs to the same identity as the previous record. So that this value is only useful if the record for the same identity are grouped sequentially. It allows the aggregator to skip correlation on all subsequent matching records if they share the same multiplex value. We'll understand this in detail. Now this is the rule that we are writing. In this case, we are setting this IQ source application map.put and IQ multiplex identity. So as the data is being read by the aggregator, we are saying that it should be separated using this reserved word IQ source application, and IQ multiplex identity is used so that it could skip correlation if it belongs to the same identity. And we are returning a map over here. Let us understand it using our connector debug. Now, connector debug is a command we have used in case of delimited file connectors, JDBC connectors, to look at the resource object. I've mentioned what is resource object. Resource object is used everywhere over here. So resource object is actually the complete user account created after aggregation with all the attributes in the schema. So I'm writing connector debug, and one of the valid method is test, iterate, and get. These are the valid methods. So connector debug, application name, test. I will test my connection over here. Test is successful. Connector debug, iterate. So when I write iterate over here, we will look at one particular resource object. So this is the resource object. Look at the entry keys over here. I have IQ multiplex identity, IQ source application. So this IQ source application is having a value. So it is saying this particular record belongs to this particular application. So this is the use of IQ source application. It is telling me that this particular resource object, it is telling the aggregator that this particular object belongs to which particular application. This is a reserved word. This IQ multiplex identity contains identity name. So value equal over here, identity name. Now let's say these two are same. These two are same over here. So for these two resource object, if they belong to the same entity, the correlation would not be run again, because again if these are the same value over here, the correlation is already decided. So in this case, this second reserved word, IQ multiplex identity, is used so that if it belongs to the same identity, again the correlation is not run for that relevant object. So this is resource objects. We could see these two reserved words, IQ multiplex identity and IQ source application. And this is important for our understanding. This will tell the aggregator to which account, to which application the account belongs. And this IQ multiplex identity will talk about whether to skip correlation if the matching records share the same multiplex identity value. So this is defined. We'll also define correlation over here. So in this case, we are going for account correlation, where we're saying employee ID matches with employee ID. This is the correlation we are leveraging. And again, as I mentioned, that in this case, we are using our build map rule. We could have also used the customization rule in this case. And this customization rule works on resource object. So the updated resource object, it could be used for customizing this resource object. I will show you one example of customization rule over here as well. So difference between build map and customization rule is, build map rule works on building the map representation of the delimited file data, and it is a iterative rule, runs for every line. On the other hand, customization rule, so this is an example of a customization rule. In customization rule, we will be using object.get and object.put. Object.get and object.put. So we can query anything using the context. We can use object.get and object.put to update the resource object. So this is a customization rule. Example of a customization rule. So this rule is configured on application and it is called after the connector has built the resource objects from the native application data. And in this case, what we are doing, we are looking at our data. We are saying if the data over here is having a group, and this group belongs to admin over here, domain over here is equal to admin. So we are adding a privilege flag. So this is an example of a customization rule where I'm adding a particular flag if in case the user belongs to a particular group. So this is an example over here. And again, as I mentioned, that you could use object.get and object.put. In this case, I'm using object.put and marking it is admin equal to true if the user belongs to a particular group. So this is an example of a customization rule. In this case, we are using a build map rule, and these two reserved words we are using, IIQ source application and IIQ multiplex identity. We are building a map representation of our data, returning a map. So in this case, we are leveraging we are using a build map rule. So I will save this particular configuration. So understanding these two reserved words, IIQ multiplex identity and IIQ source application, is important, and they are driving the aggregation process over here. We have a single object, so we are using account aggregation. So aggregate multiplex app base. I'm selecting which application to scan. Multiplex app base. Again, the same options: detect deleted accounts and disable optimization of unchanged accounts. Unlike logical application, we have defined correlation in this case. So it is not a subset, it is a new application. And the difference is that in this application, in this feed file, we had records of multiple applications. So this is being executed. So once the task is complete, all the accounts are scanned, identities have been updated. Now, if I go to application definition now, my lot of enterprise apps have been created as part of my rule that we were writing. So this rule, build map rule, is being executed. It is passing the data and creating multiplex targeted applications. So when I go to any of these applications, so these are child applications created from my base application. And when I go to these applications, I go to configuration. So nothing is provided over here because again, they are child applications. When I go to schema, so this is my parent schema. The same parent application schema is provided, is automatically populated over here. And this is the most important piece. When I go to accounts, so not only my multiplexed applications were created, my data is also segregated now. So this is the user with a particular application accountment. So all the users belonging to this particular application are now part of this particular application object. When I open these identities, so when I open these identities as well, and when I go to application accounts, I could see that these multiplexed application link have been added to their profiles as well. So I know which particular targeted application they belong to. So similarly, from my base application, multiplexed targeted applications have been created. This was a base application. In a base application, we don't have any accounts. As the aggregator runs, so over here, if I go to accounts, we don't have any accounts in a base application. As the aggregator is running, it is looking at this IQ source application if it is existing in the resource object, And this IQ source application tells the aggregator to which application this account belongs. So this is what is happening as our build map rule is being executed in this case. So now we have separate targeted applications created based on a single feed file, a single resource. Multiplex targeted applications are created in our environment. You could see multiplex targeted applications are created. So this is the use case of our multiplex application. So we talked about two important things. We talked about our logical connector and multiplex connector. These are listed as optional exercises in your module 1, but make sure that you complete both of them. These are two optional exercises. The next thing that we are going to discuss over here is we are going to talk about, so we discussed about special case connectors. So over here we discussed about logical and multiplex. Now we will talk about scheduled tasks and custom task scheduling. So these tasks that we are creating for aggregation are not one time. We don't have to execute them one time. We'll also have to schedule these tasks so that they are run in a sequential manner. So how do we schedule a particular task? So this is what we will discuss now, how we will schedule a particular task. Now, before we go ahead and talk about scheduling, we have three important task objects that we should be aware of. So we have three task objects in debug page that we should be aware of. So we have a task definition, we have a task schedule, and we have a task result. These are the three task objects that we should be aware of. Task definition stores metadata about the task. For example, what all options you have configured, what all options you have selected will be part of your task definition. Whenever we schedule any task, it is the task schedule is stored in this particular object, which is task schedule. When we are running the result, when we are running a particular task, the result of the task is stored in this task result. So these are three important objects that we should be aware of. So when I go to debug page, which is the object modeling page of SailPoint, when I write task, we have three important objects: task definition, result, and schedule. So when I open task definition, so when I open any task definition object, see the XML contains what all options were selected. So whether that option was set to true, so it contains the definition of the task or which argument was set to true. So this is the task template over here. This is task definition. When I go to task schedule object, any task that is scheduled will be stored in task schedule. So for example, this particular task, this cron expression tells me when this particular task would be executed. So this is a schedule of the task. So for example, it is saying perform maintenance runs every 5 minutes. And I could see that my cron expression is set to run every 5 minutes. So this is task schedule object. And then we have task result. So whenever we are executing any particular task, the result of the task is stored in this task result. So now I will go to setup task and we schedule a particular task. So to schedule a particular task, select your particular task, go ahead and click on schedule. So this is what I'm selecting. So I'm saying schedule financial application aggregation, and I'm saying I would like to schedule it on a, So these are the default schedules available: once, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually. So for example, I want to run it, I'm saying that I want to run it every 2 hours. So by default, we do not have a schedule available. So right now I will select daily. My requirement is I would like to schedule this task every 2 hours, but the 2 hour schedule is not available. So I'm selecting daily. I'm saying schedule. So my task is now available in my schedule task tab, and this is my schedule task. So it is saying next execution is on this particular date. Now, if I want to go for a custom schedule, if I want to design a custom schedule for this particular task, I will have to modify my cron expression that is stored in my task schedule object. So see what I could do over here. So right now it is, the schedule is set to run daily, but I would like to run it every 2 hours. So I could again go to debug page. And since this out of the box schedule is not provided, I could go to task schedule. And this is my application that I scheduled over here. This is the application for which I have scheduled the task. And the cron expression over here is right now set to run on a daily basis. Now I could use sites like, so I could use sites for custom cron expression generator. So I'm going to my search engine and saying generate cron expressions. So I'm providing the link of this site on the chat window. I'm sending it to everyone. Over here, for example, I would like to run it every 2 hours. So I'm saying 2 hours over here. I would like a cron expression to be generated for every 2 hours. Now this is the cron expression that is generated. So I will copy the cron expression. Now over here, you could schedule it in seconds, minutes, days, month, year, whatever custom schedule that you want. And then you could modify over here in your task schedule object to go for a custom task scheduling based on your custom schedule. So now this cron expression is now updated in my task schedule object, and now it will be executed every 2 hours. So this is how you could modify, you could schedule a particular task and go for custom scheduling. You could generate a custom schedule by modifying the cron expression on your task schedule object. So to create a custom schedule, schedule for any default schedule from UI, and then go to the task schedule object of that particular task and modify the cron expression, update the cron expression for whatever custom schedule that you want to run. Now we'll talk about some special tasks over here that are again for improvement of your performance of your environment, or some special tasks that you should be aware of. The first task that we have is run rule. So let me know if you have any doubts in the custom scheduling. And second task is our sequential task launcher. The first special task we are talking about is run rule. So what is this run rule task? As the name suggests, whenever you want to run a rule from a task, you could use this run rule task. Till now what we were doing, so rules are mapped internally to applications, like we were saying build map rule getting executed when we run our aggregation task. So if a rule is mapped under a particular process, it will get executed when that particular task is triggered, like aggregation task. Like aggregation task was triggering my rules, so this was happening. I could also execute my rules by going to debug page. So I could say rule over here, and let's say I want to run this particular rule, report uncorrelated identities. I would like to run this particular rule. So in this rule, we are printing the name of the identity for which correlated status is set to false. So if I go ahead, I could write my rule name that I would like to execute over here, and I would say run rule. So now output over here is redirected to Apache Tomcat over here, and I could see my list of identities that failed correlation. Now this is a manual process where I am going to debug page and executing a rule. Now let's say you have a similar requirement where you would like to run a particular rule, prepare a list and send to your compliance team, or you would like to capture some process metrics from your environment, and you would like to schedule a rule to be run in a particular frequency. So your requirement is that you want to run a rule at scheduled intervals. How we can accomplish that? So we could use this run rule task to schedule a rule to be executed from a particular task in our environment. So now rather than manually executing it, we'll go to setup, we'll go to task, and we have multiple rules, multiple tasks templates provided, and one of the task template is this run rule. So this is a task, run rule task. This select an object is the different rules that we have in our environment. So right now I'm saying I would like to run this particular rule that prints my current time and date, and I would like to run it from a task. In the rule config, you can provide any arguments to the rule in your key value pair. So if you would like to provide any arguments, that could be done by specifying them in rule config in a comma separated values. So in a CSV format example, key value pair like it is listed over here. So these pairs will be passed on to the rule in a map argument called config. So that could also be done. I'm going ahead and executing this task and going to task results. So this is executed now. Now over here is this rule that is running that is printing my current time and date over here. So now we are using a rule, using a task to run a rule in our environment. So this is the rule I was executing. It was printing my current time and date in this particular format, and that was getting printed. I was using a task to execute my rule in my environment. And again, similarly that I talked about, you could modify the cron expression, schedule this particular task to execute it at regular interval. So you could schedule it, you could further modify cron expressions in task schedule if you want to go for a custom schedule. So all that could be done. So you could use this particular task to execute any rule in your environment. Dipali, which application date and time you're talking about? Please explain your question. Which application date and time you're talking about? System date. Yeah, system date could be changed. And so specifically it is done for when we will go into uh, when we'll go into our reminders reminders and escalations. So in this case, you could leverage a time machine, which we'll talk about. So time machine can change your JVM time. So this is required in modules like policy or certifications, where you would like to advance your JVM time. So that could be done using time machine. So we'll talk about how time machine is configured in our coming sessions, but time machine is available in SailPoint, where you could advance time of your JVM. Okay, so this was one of the things that we discussed. So we have sequential task launcher. So what is sequential task launcher? So right now what we are doing, we have configured one application, we are creating one aggregation task template. So we are either going for account aggregation, or we are going for account as well as group aggregation, depending on what object types we have configured. Now let's say our requirement is now that, let's say our requirement is that we have a lot of important applications configured, we have a lot of aggregation tasks. A requirement over here is that I would like to run these tasks in a particular sequence for optimization, because if you execute all these tasks in the same time, they could get starved in your environment. So they could get starved, meaning they will not get the relevant processor time. So sequential task launcher is generally used in your production environments to optimize when which particular task would be called and in which particular sequence. So once you have created these task templates, rather than scheduling these individual tasks, we could use this sequential task launcher in order to sequentially launch these tasks in a production environment on a daily basis, or whatever is a requirement, we could do that. Let us look at the sequential task launcher. So we could go to setup, we could go to tasks, and second important task that we are talking about is our sequential task launcher. So this is sequential task launcher. So when I go to sequential task launcher, over here, I could enter the list of tasks we would like to run and in which particular sequence they should be executed. So over here, for example, we have configured these templates. So I'm saying I would like to run my authoritative applications first and refresh them. Then I would like to run my aggregate LDAP accounts. Then I would like to run my aggregate LDAP groups. So I would like to run these tasks in a particular sequence. I'm saying first this should be executed, followed by the second task, followed by third tasks. So task will be run in the order they are entered. So until and unless my first task completes, my second and third task would not be launched. So they would be launched in the order they are entered. I could also provide task execution timeout. For example, I'm specifying 2400 milliseconds. So this is the time that SailPoint would wait before terminating a particular task. So in this case, every task would be given this particular execution timeout in milliseconds before which a particular task would be terminated. This is again to prevent tasks from getting starved and running endlessly in your environment. We could print log statements after a task is completed, after a particular task is completed. And this is the most important part: cease execution if one of the executing task encounters an error. So if I select this, If my first task fails due to an issue in my aggregation in my authoritative application, my first task fails, my all tasks that are after this will never get executed. So LDAP and LDAP groups will not get executed. Similarly, if I get error in my account aggregation, my group aggregation will not get triggered. So I could cease execution if one of my executing task encounters an error. So using this sequential task launcher, we could optimize the running sequence of tasks in our production environment. Rather than going for individual scheduling, we could leverage this sequential task launcher to select a set of task templates that would be executed in a particular order. And again, like any other task, you could schedule this particular task, modify the cron expression, so all that you could do. So use this sequential task launcher in production environment to optimize the performance and launch these tasks in a particular sequence. So second important task we talked about is sequential task launcher. The next thing is the most important task that we have been talking about, refresh task. Now we did discuss this briefly. So refresh task by default runs on all identity cubes. Now how do I constrain this particular task to run on only specific identities? I don't want that it should be run on all my users, because in a production environment you could have a lot of users, so you will never run this task on all your users. You will always do for a targeted refresh. So how you could customize this particular task to run on specific identities? So we could use certain flags, we could use group or population, or we could use even filtering, custom filters. So first we will talk about how we could customize a refresh task to run on specific identities. Why refresh task is being used? It has a lot of uses. Now it could check for policy violation. So this is one of the most important tasks in SailPoint. As we will go ahead, you will see in our implementation, it could refresh risk scores. When we were updating our manager values, that was being done. It could refresh roles, which roles are assigned to the user. It could provision access. So a lot of important options are available in refresh task. So how we could customize this to run on specific identities, we're talking about this now. So first we are talking about how you could use this filters, custom filters in a refresh task. So I will go to setup, tasks, and open this refresh identity cube. This is one of the most important tasks in SailPoint. Look at some of the options over here. You could refresh identity attributes, refresh manager status, provision assignments, refresh role metadata, synchronize attributes. A lot of important options are there. You could also check for risk, refresh risk scorecards. We can check for policy violation. So this particular task is one of the central tasks in our implementation. So we can check for active policies that we have configured in SailPoint. So by default, it runs on all identities. It refreshes all identities. Now, I could optionally provide a list of groups or population names to constrain it. I could optionally provide filter string. So first we are talking about this filter string that we could provide to customize this particular task to run on specific identities. For example, over here, a filter string is, as an example, is provided department equal to finance. So if I provide that, it will run on only those users for which department is equal to finance. We could use SailPoint to create this filter strings. So I will say open advanced analytics, intelligence advanced analytics. Now we want to use SailPoint to generate these filters for us. We can go to advanced search. In advanced search, we have host of objects present over here that we could use to create these filters. For example, I'm saying that I would only like to refresh users present in this financials application. So I'm adding this particular filter. I'm saying application equals financials, add filter. I would like to add another filter now. So let's say I would like to only filter users for which status is equal to contractor. So I'm saying status is equal to contractor, another filter. And let's say policy raw score, I'm saying is less than or equal to 2. So I'm adding these filters. Now all these three filters are available now. I could now select which filters will be mapped in which operation. So I'm selecting they should be mapped in AND operation. So I'm saying group selected, meaning both of them should be true. And I'm mapping them in OR condition, meaning which either of them should be true. So I'm saying group selected. Once I have mapped my filter in these operation types and an OR, I can click on this view edit filter source. So this is the filter string that is automatically generated for us, which now we could use in our refresh task. So I could select this filter string, I could go back to my task and then update this filter string, and now my refresh task will be constrained to run on only those identities that specify that criteria. So whether you have to run it on a single identity or you have to run it on identities that matches a particular condition, you could customize this filter string and you could use this advanced analytics to generate these filter strings for you like I was doing. So you could use this advanced search to select particular objects and which value you would like to filter on. And then once this filter string is generated, you could use it in your refresh task. So this is one option. Rather than yourself generating filter strings, use SailPoint Advanced Analytics to generate filter strings for you and constrain your refresh task. Second option over here is that we could use this groups and population to optionally refresh. So we have talked about in detail about these groups and populations. So if I go to setup groups, now let's say I would like to refresh only on a specific set of identities. Let's say active managers, active users in Austin. So I would only like to refresh these. So I've created this from analytics now. So I could provide this as an input in my refresh task. So once I've created these populations or group factories, I could use them in my refresh task. So I could say, I could select over here active users in Austin. So now only these 26 users would be refreshed by my refresh task. So these are the two important ways. Either use a filter string or use a group or a population to constrain your identities getting refreshed by your refresh task if you don't want to launch refresh on all identities. The other option is generally what happens is whenever we do aggregation is followed by refresh task. So as to refresh, let's say any policy violation or any provisioning process that has to be triggered. So generally aggregation is followed by your refresh task to refresh your identity cubes for any new processes that has to be triggered in SailPoint or additional information that has to be updated on identity cubes. So you would find filters over here, refresh identities whose last refresh date is before this particular date, or refresh identity dates whose last refresh is this number hours ago. So I could base it on when was the identity last refreshed to further constrain my refreshing. Now this is another important thing. It says refresh only identities marked as needing refresh during aggregation. As I said, it is closely linked to aggregation over here. So to show this, let me show this over here in this environment. So now what we're talking about, let's say I only want to refresh identities that have been recently aggregated. So I will go to Home tab, Setup, Tasks, and over here, I'm running my Prism aggregation again. I'm saying execute in background. I'm running my Prism aggregation task again. So this task has been executed. Now, one of the accounts that have been scanned and updated as part of this is a user present on my Prism application. That is Walter. So if I open this particular application, if I go to Accounts tab, one of the user over here is Walter Henderson. So when I go to this particular user, I will go to debug page. So a needs refresh tag is added over here. So you could see over here that these two tags are being maintained, which I could further customize my refresh task on. One is this last refresh. Now this is called epoch value that is being maintained. So this could translate to, so this is a epoch value that could translate to a particular date and time based on which I could customize my refresh task. Or whenever you perform aggregation, this tag is being added, which is needs refresh. So you could see over here needs refresh is set to true. So again, within this needs refresh is set to true, I could customize my task to only refresh accounts for which needs refresh is set to true. So when I go to refresh task, refresh identity cube task, I could specify over here refresh only those identities that are marked as needing refresh during aggregation. So this will only refresh my those identities for which in their XML objects this needs refresh is set to true. So generally when you do aggregation in your production environment and only for those users for which aggregation has been performed, let's say we are performing a delta aggregation and only those users needs to be refreshed, you could use this particular flag that is added to identity cubes, that is needs refresh. So needs refresh flag, you could do targeted refresh on recently aggregated identities. So this needs refresh over here is being added. So again, this is very common approach. And as I again mentioned about this epoch values, let me show you that epoch values as well. Just give me a time. So this last refresh is also being saved, and we could also use this epoch converter to convert to time. So for example, over here, you could see that in this identity object, so these are called epoch values, this last login, last refresh over here. So I could copy this last refresh. I could go to my epoch converter over here and I could timestamp to human date. So I could see over here when it was last refreshed over here in this case. So customize your refresh task based on when was the last refresh performed or when it was last aggregated. So multiple ways are provided in which you could customize your refresh task to run on targeted identities. Similarly, for any object, you would be able to see when was the last refresh performed. and customize your refresh task based on that. So over here, I could see when it was last refreshed. So these filters are now provided in your refresh task to customize based on these timestamps. When was the last refresh performed? You could customize it based on your timestamps. So when I go to my refresh identity cube task, and over here, as I mentioned, that refresh identities whose last refresh date is, you could select over here and go for targeted refresh. Okay, so with this completed, anyone having any doubts in epoch values or targeted refresh? Please go ahead, ask if you have any doubts. So we have discussed about, we have talked about two special case connectors, logical multiplex. We talked about schedule task and custom task scheduling. We discussed about these two special tasks. Another important thing that I would like to discuss is aggregation strategies. So what are the different aggregation strategies available? So what are the different aggregation strategies? So there are 4 aggregation strategies that could be used. So these are the 4 aggregation strategies that could be used. In a nutshell, there are 2. So there are mainly 2 aggregation strategies, which are full aggregation, and second is called delta aggregation. Delta aggregation. So these are the 2 aggregation strategies, full aggregation and delta aggregation. Full means you would be reading all accounts. All accounts from target application could be read. But let's say that you have a large application that you're maintaining. You have 10,000 accounts. You cannot every day run aggregation on all those accounts, considering you have multiple applications. So for that, we have delta aggregation. Delta means not full aggregation, but part aggregation, that is generally targeted aggregation, part aggregation. Now in all the aggregation tasks that I have created till now, I was forcing SailPoint to do a full aggregation. Since I was doing a first time aggregation, I was forcing SailPoint to do a full aggregation. But further, I could optimize my aggregation strategy to go for delta. So these are the 4 aggregation strategies: process all accounts or full aggregation, identity IQ based optimization, custom delta processing, and connector based delta aggregation. Let us understand what are these. So let us understand what are these. So these are my aggregation strategies. So see what process all will do. The entire accounts from target application will be pulled into identity IQ. So this is process all. Process all or full aggregation is done when in your aggregation task. When I go back to my aggregation task, I'm going to set up task. When I go back to my aggregation task, in all the aggregation tasks which I have configured, I'm setting this particular tag. Which tag it is? This is the particular tag available in my aggregation task that says disable optimization of unchanged accounts. Disable optimization of unchanged accounts is set to true. It means I would like to use process all. All application accounts would be read into SailPoint. So see, this is my aggregation task. I have this disable optimization of unchanged accounts. It says use this option to force all accounts to be aggregated. It means full aggregation I want. So this is my first aggregation strategy. Second aggregation strategy is, in this case, I'm reading all accounts, but I am bringing only the changes that have been made on target application. So that is the default identity IQ default optimization. This is being done when I disable this particular option. So when I go ahead and disable this particular option, it will go for my second aggregation strategy where it will read every account on target but only bring in the changes. So this is sale point default. Disable optimization of unchanged accounts if unselected. What it is doing, every account is read, only those accounts with changes are processed. Task option disable optimization of unchanged accounts is set to false. So this is sale point default optimization aggregation strategy. The third strategy that we have is custom delta processing. So manage own change, write changed accounts to a flat file and process that particular flat file over here. So in this custom delta processing, this particular option is selected, which is detect deleted account equal to false. Custom delta processing over here forces a sync. So the this particular strategy is more focused on the synchronization over here. Sync means, let's say the application admin is deleting account on target. Deleting an account on target after we have performed the aggregation over here. So after aggregating, so in this case, account application account exists in sale point, but it is deleted on target. So in this case, what is happening? Application account exists in sale point since we did it before it was deleted, exists in sale point, but it is deleted on target. So in this case, if this custom delta processing is enabled, how to enable this? When detect deleted accounts is set to true, when this flag is set to true, so detect and delete accounts in sale point that no longer exist in target application. So this is for custom delta processing where sale point will make sure if an account is deleted on target, the same link is removed in sale point. So link is removed in sale point so that SailPoint does not again try to recreate the account for the user on target application. In this case, both application and SailPoint should be in sync. So this is custom delta processing. In this case, the focus is on if there any are right changes that are available on the target application, they are synced first. The priority is given to those accounts in custom delta processing. The last approach is connector-based delta aggregation. Now read and process only accounts with changes that have taken place after benchmark. So like last modified date, USN changed attribute. Now this connector based delta aggregation is not available for all applications, for specific applications. So for specific application that supports delta aggregation. For example, let us look at this application, LDAP application that we configured, which is a directory application that we onboarded. So if I go to application, application definition, let me go to LDAP. So this application provides some delta techniques. Application connector itself provides some delta techniques. So when I go to configuration, so over here, some delta techniques are provided that we could leverage, we could use in our delta aggregation. Let us look at these. So see, when I go down over here, in this case, we have delta aggregation mode available, provided in by direct sync or USN changed attribute. What are these? This direct sync is a mechanism, and this USN change is an attribute available in my application schema. So based on which also delta aggregation this application is supporting. So we have an attribute over here called USN changed. So on this as well, delta aggregation is supported. So if I go to my task over here, I could also go ahead and enable delta aggregation over here, but this requires support from my connector. So enable the connector to aggregate only those accounts that have changed since the last aggregation, but this requires support from connector. So this technique, the last technique that we are talking about, it is connector based delta aggregation. Will depend on connector to connector, whether they give you any mechanism to process only delta accounts. Like for example, in AD, we talked about a USN changed attribute or direct sync. So this would be enabled when you go to the aggregation task and enable delta aggregation equal to true. So depending on what you configure inside your aggregation task, your relevant aggregation strategy is enabled. So as I mentioned over here, like you could go to application over here, and in your application, you could select which delta aggregation mode, and then in your aggregation task, you could enable this option to enable delta aggregation. So this will now leverage your connector delta settings to go for a targeted aggregation from your target application. So this requires support from connector, not available for all connectors. So these are different aggregation strategies. Sagrika, I will discuss this. Give me some time. I will discuss this after this. Okay, so we have talked about this. Now, what is left over here? So these are different aggregation strategies, and that will depend on which particular options you're selecting in your aggregation task. So let's talk about improving performance a bit. What all we could use to improve the performance in our environment. So we'll talk about from performance point of view, what all we could do. So one thing we have already talked about in performance, that aggregation strategies could be applied depending on whether we would like to go for full aggregation or delta aggregation or connector based or sale point default. In identity refresh strategies, we have already discussed that identity refresh task can take time due to processing involved. So refresh only identities that have changed, go for delta refresh. And how we can go for delta refresh, we have already discussed. Aggregation marking cubes with changes for refresh processing. We could use filters, timestamps, split refresh into different tasks. What does this means? So rather than making one refresh task do everything in your environment, split it. So when I say split it over here, create multiple task templates out of the same task. For example, this is my refresh identity cube task. Now let's say I want to use a particular task to only check for policy violation. So from this template task, I could create a new task for policy violation, but in this I will only check for policy violation. So I'm saying only check for active policies, which means since this is a template task, what is a template task in SailPoint? That allows you to create multiple templates. So this is a template task. You could create multiple templates. So create multiple templates over here. One say for policy violation checking, second for risk modeling, third for processing accounts. So since you can create multiple templates rather than using the same task to do everything, split it into different tasks, create multiple templates and schedule it as per your need. So over here, we could schedule the task as per our need. We could split the refresh task into different tasks over here. I've talked about what is splitting over here. So splitting is you could create multiple templates out of that task. You could do things like multi-threading, partitioning, and limit number of thread partitions to improve performance. Let us do this as well. So I will go back to my home tab. Now one partitioning we discussed at the connector level. Partitioning can also be done at the task level. So I could go to setup task. I could also introduce partitioning at my task level. So I'm saying aggregate. Let us do it on track application. So this is my track application aggregation task. And now in this case, I would be enabling my partitioning. So this is my aggregation task for track. Select application is track. Now to further improve the partitions, I could enable partitioning. I could say, I want to enable partitioning over here. And I'm saying partition into 10 accounts. So I would like to create partitions of 10 each. What is this loss limit? So this loss limit is the maximum number of already aggregated accounts which will be aggregated again. If in case aggregation fails, SailPoint would try to re-aggregate them. So a value of 0 means all accounts will be re-aggregated. So if in case my partitioning is failing, it will try my re-aggregation of those accounts if I specify a loss limit. So I'm going ahead and executing this task, save and execute. So now we are running this particular task with partitioning at task level. I'm going to task results. Now this is my task running with partitioning now. So when I go down, I could see that multiple partitions are getting executed over here. So now you could see this task is divided into partitions of 10 each. So now these partitions are getting executed, and this is the importance of partitioning. So after reading each partition, it is getting committed over here. So I could see that data over here is partitioned over here. And I can now see that all my 140 accounts were scanned and identities were updated. Accounts were scanned and identities were updated. And I could go down and see my partitioning results, that my data has been partitioned. So partitioning is supported splitting up tasks across multiple servers and threads. 3 items can be partitioned. At the application level, for certain connectors like LDAP, AD, JDBC, on identity refresh task, or even in certifications can be partitioned, which we'll discuss later. So for partitioning, what we were able to see, so we were able to see these partitioning results. So we were able to see that tasks are getting partitioned over here. What are some of the things that we should be aware of partitioning? So we should limit partitions to fewer than 50. We should not go for more partitions. We should watch for connections. We should ensure ability of server to terminate tasks, and we could go for monitoring of these like I was going in my task results. But make sure that you do not have more than 50 partitions created at task level whenever you're doing context switching and things like that. So you don't have to create more than 50 partitions. Now you could also look at your server object. Depending on which version you're using, you could look at how many request threads or task threads are being running on your server to see your CPU load. So where you could see this, in your later versions, 7.3 and above, this is available by going to your administration console. So now what we are talking about, to see how much, to see about our environment details about the servers that we have configured, what is the load, you could go to environment. In 7.3 and above, you could go to administration console and environment. You could look at the different hosts you have configured. Now, heartbeat is your service that tells whether your server is up or down. So you can see over here when was the last heartbeat received. And you could see over here your memory percentage, CPU percentage, number of threads getting executed. So all those details you would be able to see. And I could also configure over here which services I want to listen in, like heartbeat service, monitoring, request. So these are different services for which I am listening over here. And I could configure my monitoring cycles, like number of seconds between monitoring cycles over here. So this is configured as 300 milliseconds. How many days I would like to retain my stats, and what all I want to monitor at JVM level, at my server level. So I'm monitoring for CPU, task threads, database response time, JVM memory and percentage. So I could configure what all I want to monitor to be shown in my stats over here. So depending on what all I have monitored, I would be able to look at my server health. So I could get all my statistics over here. So for example, I'm getting all my stats over here for CPU, task threads, request threads, my database response time, my memory over here. So all my stats about my server health I'm able to get. So over here, these are my, depending on my configuration, my CPU threads, task threads, again, my memory percentage, all those are being captured over here. And these are snapshots of different times they have been captured. So I could see my entire history of snapshots that are captured from my server. So this monitoring is advanced in 7.3 and above. If you go to the lower versions of SailPoint, like for example 7.3 and below, in these cases you could go to global settings and you have a configuration available called host configuration. So go to host configuration, and over here you would be able to see your host details. So this is in 7.3 and below, 7.2 and below. In 7.3 and above, you have an administration console. So over here you could see all your details, but not much details like in your 7.3 versions and above, where I was able to see a detailed stat about my server health. So over here I was able to see a detailed stats about my server health. When I'm doing server monitoring, I'm able to capture my snapshots, and I am also able to configure which services to listen in for, which services I want to listen in for at my services level and at my server or JVM level, which services I would like to listen in for. So that could be configured, and stats could be retained just like your identity snapshots. Another important thing is whatever objects that you're capturing, be it your snapshots, be it your task results, you have to configure their retention strategy or how long you would like to retain these. So that also has to be configured, and then based on your configuration, maintenance task would be deleting them. So another best practice over here is define retention of your objects. So decide retention of your objects over here. So that could be configured over here, and your maintenance task would, based on your configuration, it will prune those objects, as we have discussed in our previous sessions as well. So in this case, what we could do is we could go to global settings. I could go to my configuration over here, and over here we could decide which objects I would like to retain and for how long. So go to MISC tab over here and decide your object expirations over here to further optimize your environment. So this is when your different objects would be deleted from your environment, so that you're doing housekeeping at application tier level, at your database level as well. So you're doing pruning of objects that are getting stored in your environment. So different object expirations could be specified. For example, I'm deciding how long I would like to keep syslogs, snapshots, task results. after which they will be deleted. And then depending on my configuration, we talked about a scheduled task that will run and delete those in our environment. So this is the task that we talked about, perform maintenance, and then based on your configuration, it could further delete those in your environment over here. So it can prune snapshots, task results, requests, depending on the object expiration that you set over here. So this is another common practice which you have to do in order to prune objects from your environment. Now, one last thing we'll discuss over here is called call timings. So call timings is very important, and these call timings are being maintained. So what are call timings? We'll understand this call timings. So first of all, when you have to go for performance monitoring, let's say of a particular rule, so you could measure the rule performance by adding the following things in your code. So you could import SailPoint API.meter. You could enter over here. So begin your code over here and exit your code. So what is this meter method? This meter method can track number of calls, calculate minimum, maximum, average execution time, and then you will be able to know that how many times your rule has been executed, what is the minimum execution time, maximum execution time, to look at the performance of your rules. Not only rules, but all call timings are recorded. So you could add the following example code to your rules, or any rule for which you want to monitor its performance and calculate your execution time. And then you can go to debug page. You could go to debug page over here, and in debug page you have these call timings available. So go to call timings, and these call timings are available. So these call timings, you could know how many times a process has been triggered, how many hits, errors, minimum, maximum, or average execution time. So when you're writing rules, it is a good practice to execute this meter to know about what is the minimum and maximum execution time taken by your code to execute, to further measure your rule performance as you go for configuration of rules in your environment. Okay, so one final thing we will discuss over here is about correlation, after which we will take a break. So we have been talking about correlation. We have discussed that whenever we have a failed correlation in our environment, we can go for manual correlation. We could track those correlation, and we can go for manual correlation as well. So first of all, where we could track correlation failures. So now what we are talking about, in this space we are discussing, so see right now we have only done the aggregation process, where we are aggregating the data into identity cubes from different target applications. And we are defining correlation for all non-authoritative applications. So when I go to correlation, I select a particular application, I will be able to see which identity failed correlation. Like in this case, in financials, I could see that this particular user failed correlation. Now what I will do over here, I will create a use case of a failed correlation, and then we will try to manually correlate. So let me try to create a failed correlation over here. Now, first of all, we should know that why this correlation can fail. So correlation failure can happen because of multiple reasons, and one of the reasons could be bad data. So let us look at why we could receive correlation failures. So correlation failures could be because of bad data. So for example, the correlation key that you're using is correct, but on the application data is not correct. Application data is having some bad data. Second could be your correlation key that you're writing is not robust enough, is not unique. So correlation key is not unique, or you could also find errors in the aggregation task. So aggregation task that is trying to attempt correlation, it fails. So correlation can fail because of multiple reasons. And as I mentioned, where you could track these correlation failures by going to identity, identity correlation, you will be able to track for correlation failures. So for example, I'm saying financials, and I could see over here, this identity failed correlation. So when I go to identity, identity warehouse, if I write Adam Kennedy over here, now I have two identity cubes. One is my authoritative identity cube. So this is my authoritative identity cube. Why authoritative identity cube? Because this contains my authoritative application link. This is my authoritative application link. But due to failed correlation, since correlation failed, SailPoint created a new identity cube to accommodate this particular user. So when I go to this particular user, to accommodate this application account, since correlation failed, SailPoint created a new dummy identity cube, and this particular account, since it could not be associated with any existing identity, is called uncorrelated account. Why uncorrelated? Because SailPoint was not SailPoint was not able to associate it with any existing identity. Now, if I go to application account, I could see all the details over here. And one of the detail available over here is this employee ID, which is same as my base identity cube. So when I go to my authoritative identity cube, this is my authoritative identity cube. And I could see that this employee ID over here is the same, meaning that account over here should over here belong to this particular identity over here. So in this case, what we could do over here, we can select over here our uncorrelated account. So what I'm doing, I'm selecting my uncorrelated account over here. This is the account I'm selecting. And we have to select a target identity to which this particular account belongs. So I could see over here, this is my correlated account. You could see over here, correlated is set to true. So it is checked. So now what we are doing over here, so we have one uncorrelated account in my identity cube that is uncorrelated. And then we have a target identity. This is my authoritative identity cube. So this is what my authoritative identity cube over here, which contains all my authoritative application links. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying merge this uncorrelated account. Merge where? Merge this uncorrelated account to my target identity. So when I perform this manual merge, this uncorrelated account will be removed from my uncorrelated identity and will be pushed to my target identity, which is authoritative over here. So this will happen over here. Now this identity will become a shell identity cube. Shell means blank. So this will become a blank identity cube, which could be deleted by my prune task. Let us see this particular process. So now what we are saying over here, that this account belongs to this correlated identity. As we have seen, they have the same employee ID. When I say perform merge, now let us go back and look at our identities over here. So when I go to identity warehouse, so this was my uncorrelated identity cube. When I open this, now since I have performed the merge, this account that was existing over here has been removed and has been pushed on my target identity cube. So when I go back and look at my authoritative identity cube, this is my authoritative identity cube over here. And when I come over here, you could see that this account is being pushed over here for financials application. This has been pushed. So this leaves behind my shell identity cube. This is a blank identity cube which was temporarily created to hold that application link. So this now becomes a shell or a blank identity cube, having no entitlements, no roles, no entitlements, having no application account. So this is a shell or blank identity cube. So now we have everything as intended, but we have an extra identity cube present in our environment. So to delete that, we can run this particular task, which is prune identity cube. Remember, this task does not delete any uncorrelated identity. It deletes only identities which are shell or blank. So delete identities that have no links and no important references. So when I go ahead and execute this, now the identity cube, the shell identity cube which was existing, will now be deleted. So when I go to task results and open the result of this particular task, prune task, you could see my identity is deleted. So now there will be one existing identity for Adam, and the shell one would have been deleted. So as originally intended, we have corrected our correlation. So now we have just one identity existing containing my application accounts as originally intended, and the temporary identity cube that was created is now deleted. So using this way, you could track for correlation failures, select your target identity with which you want to do a merge, and you would be able to perform a manual merge. For any application I could track, so in this case, in LDAP, I have 9 correlation failures. So I could see which identities, base cubes they belong to. Right now, if I open any one of these, they will only contain my non-authoritative application link. For example, I see this Oslo. So none of these identity cubes will contain my authoritative application link. You can see that both of them are non-authoritative application. So you could perform a manual merge. The same thing can be done using a rule as well. So right now, for example, I was leveraging the UI functionality where I was tracking for my correlation failures. Similar thing I could have done using a rule as well, like I showcased that a little while earlier. So in this rule, I'm printing all my uncorrelated accounts for which correlation failed. So in this rule, what I'm doing over here, I'm using query options. We'll talk about what are query options over here. I'm adding a filter where I'm checking for an inbuilt property called correlated equal to false. The Boolean property I'm checking if correlated status is set to false, and then I'm iterating over my identities while I look at the correlated status which is set to false, and I'm saying user.getName over here in a sysout statement. So I'm printing the name of the identities for which correlated status is set to false. So when I execute this particular rule, again, I could get the name of identities for which the correlation failed. So this is the name of our identities that are failing correlation over here on my different applications. So I can also leverage a rule to to look at the identities that have failed correlation and go for manual merge in order to correct correlation. Okay, so with this we have covered. I will take the questions. Just give me a minute. Let me see if anything is left in module 1 to be discussed. Okay, okay, so let me take the questions on the chat window. Yes, you could add a call timing API for any task in your environment. And as I mentioned, this is a call meter you could add for you could add a call meter for any task, any custom task that you're creating. So you just have to import SailPoint API.meter, and you could add meter over here, a meter enter or meter exit. So you could monitor the performance of tasks as well, the call timings in task as well. But generally this is not required because any task that is getting executed already has the meter available. So when I go to any tasks, I go to task results, I have this execution time available already. So that is not really required. So I could see a started date, I could see a completed date. More detailed view is available over here. So for example, I'm going to again console over here, administration console. So I'm going to administration console. In administration console, these call timings are already available. Go to completed over here, and you could see over here that I could see a start date, a end date, and further I could see the difference in the timings, whether it is up or down. So I could see over here for this particular task, the call timings is 14 seconds up. So it has taken 14 seconds more when I enabled partitioning. I was creating partitions of 2 each. So these call timings are already pre-built into these tasks. So generally for rules, it is required because rules you would like to look at the performance part. Can we correct correlation using rule? Yes, you could do that, but in that case, you should have a common condition on which you are correcting correlation, because rule is built on a logic. Like in this case, we are looking at employee ID. So in this case, you could also iterate over those accounts and look at if they belong to a particular employee ID. See, they failed correlation because whatever the key that you defined was not unique. So in this case, human intelligence is required. So, but rule can also be written, but there should be a logic. For example, now let's say for these accounts, you want to leverage a new correlation key. So because the original correlation key did not work, meaning it had some shortfalls, the data was incorrect or things like that. So in this case, if you're leveraging a new correlation key, you could do the correlation leveraging a rule as well. So that could be done. So this I showcased, it did not fail correlation as you have seen initially, Raja. I created it to show that how you could manually correlate. I did not fail correlation, but I showcased it in order to show you how to correct correlation. So, okay, or other questions that we have is, okay, so that is fine. Targeted refresh. Okay, so targeted refresh, I talked about certain things that I discussed, and targeted refresh. So for targeted refresh, I talked about that you could specify a filter. You could specify a filter, you could specify a group or a population, or do it on epoch values, or do it on a particular tag that is present after aggregation is done, and that is needs refresh. So whenever you do any whenever you do any aggregation task, this particular tag is added to the identity XML that is needs refresh. So if you only want to refresh those accounts for which aggregation has been performed recently, you could tick this and run your refresh task. So let me know which one you did not understand so I could explain that, which one you did not understand in this. The last part, okay? So epoch values and aggregation, okay? So when you go to any particular task over here, so for example, I'm going to debug page. I'm going to debug page over here. Let's say I'm looking at identity XML over here. So this is my identity XML. And over here in every identity XML, you will have these dates available. For example, over here, I could see this last login, last refresh. So for example, I open this last refresh. So this is called a epoch value. And this could be converted to a human readable value timestamp. So I could copy it over here and I'm saying I could see that it was updated an hour ago. So let's say I would like to modify my refresh task based on when the last refresh was performed on the identity. I would like to refresh all those identities that have not been refreshed in the past 1 day or past 2 hours. I could do that in my refresh task. I'd go to setup tasks, open your refresh identity cube, and see over here, I can control over here refreshed identities whose last refresh date is before this date. And as I showed you that this refresh date is maintained on identity objects. So I could control over here which identities I would like to refresh over here. So again, based on the last refresh date that is maintained on identity objects. So hours ago refresh date is within these number of hours. So these are all for targeted refresh. So this is around the epoch value that is stored on identity objects. Then I could also do it based on a specific tag that is added to identities. So let me showcase that as well. So for example, as I mentioned that when I'm running a aggregation task, so for example, over here, we are running this aggregation task for Prism application. I'm saying schedule and I'm aggregating this. I would run this particular aggregation task. So I'm saying execute in background. I will go to task results and this particular task is getting executed. I could see 2 accounts have been scanned and updated. So when I go to my when I go to application definition, we have just 2 accounts getting aggregated as part of this application. So when I'm running my aggregation task right now, when I go to accounts, I could see 2 accounts were aggregated, Prism admin and Walter Henderson over here. So let me go to this identity cube of this particular person, Walter. So I will go to debug page, identity over here, identity object, and I will open this identity object over here. And now I could see that since I have performed my aggregation right now, this tag has been added over here, which says needs refresh. So over here, this needs refresh is set to true, and this needs refresh over here is can be set on identities that have recently gone through the aggregation process. So let's say I'm doing a delta aggregation. I'm not doing a full aggregation, I'm doing delta. And for those changes that have been brought in from my target application, I would like to only refresh those identities. So in that case, I could even modify my refresh task to run only on those identities. So when I go to refresh identity cube task, one of the option available is, so this tag was added when I was running my aggregation task. So I can say refresh only identities marked as needed refresh during aggregation. So now what is the use case over here? Let's say I have 10,000 accounts, but only for two, the disable status was set on the target application. Now, once the disable status is coming in my Delta feed onto SailPoint, I want that these identities, only these two identities should be refreshed. So what I will do is, once the aggregation would run, it would set this particular tag on my identity that is needs refresh, and then I would customize my refresh task to only refresh those identities. So see, everything is linked. So this needs refresh will only be added on those two identities. And then when I'm running my refresh task, I would customize my refresh task to only refresh these two identities for which this tag is being set. Let me know if you understood it. Okay, so another question on the chat window is there a way to measure performance improvement and show via pie chart? Now, so for that, you could create a customized report, but there are some reports available for specific purposes. So there is a report available for your environment. If you're looking specifically, so the pie chart you want of the partitioning you're seeing. Correct me if you're wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. So not for that, out of the box there is nothing, but you could create a custom report if you want that. But out of the box, there is no report available. There's one report available for environment, but no report for your task that could give you a pie chart analysis of your task status or partitioning. But a custom report can be created. SailPoint allows you to create custom reports. Which environment? This environment over here. Okay, the environment report. So this environment report over here talks about, so this again is related to performance. So if I go to intelligence reports, we have one environment report available. Let me show you that environment report. So this is an environment report that could talk about the stats about your environment. So generally, when you face issues in your environment, SailPoint asks you these reports where you talk about what all is going on your environment. This will give all the details about the different stats of your environment over here. So a basic health checkup of your environment is in this environment report. So if I view my report results, so all my environment report is listed over here. So what are the number of identities, active identities, uncorrelated identities, license identities, identities by type. So all those are listed over here. Number of applications I have onboarded, how many values I have in different applications, proxy applications. So my complete detailed analysis of my report is listed over here. And again, this could tell about your what are the average number of links. So this is a complete health check of your environment that will talk about any concern areas that I have in my environment that could be specified. So I could see number of violations, all my details about my environment over here. Connections, what are the connections I'm leveraging? What is the database type? So all my system configurations environment report tells about that. So this could list any problem issues with your environment that they need to work out on. But yeah, so this is a detailed environment report. As I mentioned, you could configure these task report failures. So we discussed about that you could configure email configurations at global level or individual task level, listing whenever your task fails. So that could be configured. Yes, so that could be configured, which could trigger an email notification whenever any of your task fails in your environment, so that your L2 team is updated on that. So that could be done. So that is available at both levels, at global level and task level, and that is what we have. So that is what we configured at our monitoring piece level. In our monitoring piece, we configured that. Any other questions before we take a break? After the break, we will talk about rules, tasks, and APIs. So we have been configuring different rules in our environment. We'll take a look at our SailPoint API and how we can work through different rules in our environment. So that is what we will look at in our coming session. Anything that you would like to ask or clarify in the points that we discussed today? Okay. Thank you, Arvind. Okay, what else? Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's take a break then. Right now, the time is over here 9:56. So please be back by 10:40. Please be back by 10:40, everyone. 10:35, 10:40, yeah. So we'll take a 40 minutes break. Please be back by 10:40, and then we'll continue our discussion. I will keep the meeting open.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hi everyone. Let's start a session. So we'll be talking about rules, tasks, and APIs, which is central to our implementation. We'll talk about some best practices, and we have been configuring rules, but we'll take a deep dive look into how to configure these rules. So we'll talk a bit about that. So first of all, what are rules and why we are leveraging or using rules in our environment? So rules are constructs that we are using to modify SailPoint behavior. So we are using them to modify SailPoint behavior. Now we have been we have been using rules throughout our implementation. Different types of rules we have created till now. We have worked with creation rules, which we are using to set our passwords. We looked at our correlation rules that were helping us in correlation. We looked at build map rule, customization rule. So different rules we have discussed and we have used in our aggregation strategies. Now, throughout your implementation, you would be writing rules, be it policy module, be it your certification module, be it your workflows. So they are available throughout your implementation. So understanding these rules would be central to getting into SailPoint implementation. So understanding how to read the SailPoint API and working with these rules, it will be central to your implementation. So let us start with few of the basics of rules. So these are small snippets of code that can control many aspects of identity IQ behavior. They are defined and stored as objects of type rule, loaded from XML, or could be created in your UI or created in IDE like we have worked through Eclipse, IQDA. Some of the common usages of rules are control the loading of account and group data during aggregation, define policy violations, how to display them, control behaviors of certification, help us in provisioning activities, and many more. So these are common use cases. What does a rule contain? All rules in SailPoint will include a type. So all rules will include a type. So this type will determine where this particular rule could be used in your environment. So talking about all rules include a type. See, when I go to my environment over here and go to any rule configuration. So for example, I will go to application, application definition. Now the type determines where in the UI the rule can be used and in which particular sequence this rule would be called. So now when I go to rules over here, now whenever I open any rule, all rules will include a type over here. So for example, the rule type over here is correlation. So this type will determine where in the process this rule could be mapped and what this rule will be used to accomplish over here. For example, it is saying identity correlation rule are used to find identities to which new accounts can be attached. So all rules will include a type. No matter which rule I open, it will include a type over here. Type will determine where in the UI this rule could be mapped and what would be the sequence of execution of these rules. So rules are called in a particular sequence, as we have seen earlier. They're called in a particular sequence. So all rules include a type. All rules are passing these two objects, context and log. So these are the two important objects all rules are passing. Now context is one of the most important object that a rule can pass, using which we can interact with SailPoint API. So no matter which rule we will open, we will find this log, that is the log object associated with SailPoint context, and we'll find this context, that is the API SailPoint context object used to query the SailPoint database if necessary. So let us look at this context and log. Okay. So this context over here, we have an API context available where we have different methods by which we could interact with SailPoint API over here. And we will see this context in our environment. Just give me a minute, let me open that. So this is Identity IQ stores its records in a relational database that supports all application servers for a particular instance of the application. This context object that we are talking about is passed into all Bean shell scripts in Identity IQ. This maintains an open connection in the backend relational database. So in short, we can leverage this context to interact with SailPoint database, to query for objects, to pull the objects out of the SailPoint database over here. Now, if you look at your API documentation, if you go to doc/javadoc, so in your implementation, after identity IQ write doc/javadoc, this will take you to your API documentation. Once over here, you could go to SailPoint API, you could open your SailPoint context. So it has different methods available by which you could interact with your different SailPoint objects over here. So you could see we have get object by ID, get object by name, get objects. So different methods are provided by which we could interact with our database and get different objects, modify them. So all those are available over here. and I could see different methods are provided over here. So to interact with a relational database, this context is being provided. And this log is the log4j package sale point, the Java package that we discussed about. This is being leveraged for logging purposes. So whenever we are talking about logging, log4j package is being used. So context for interacting with SailPoint API and log. The rest of the arguments over here will keep on changing depending on the rule that you would write. So the rest of the arguments over here will keep on changing depending on the rule that we are configuring over here. So log and context are available everywhere. The rest of the arguments will depend on which type of rule we are running in our environment. I also talked about a sequence of execution over here. So let's pick delimited file for example. In delimited file, we have a sequence of execution over here. So you could see over here when delimited file connector we are onboarding. So first, our non-iterative rules are being called like pre-iterate, then build map, then merge map over here, then map to resource object. Then once the resource object is being built, a customization rule is being called, then correlation, and then creation. Which means when a connector is reading the data from my target application, a sequence execution of rules is being done. Rules are executed in a particular sequence. So depending on the type of rule, it will also determine in which sequence this particular rule will be called in your environment. So rules have a particular sequence in which they are being called. So when the resource object is being built, then only customization rule can be called, because customization over here acts on the source objects. Similarly, just before the account is aggregated, is linked, a correlation rule is being called that correlates that application account onto a targeted identity cube. So all this follow a particular sequence. All rules have inputs and most expect return values. Input returns are defined in rule registry. Return object types are the actual Java object being returned, like object identity map. Returns could be list of values for maps. It could be multiple entries. For objects, this could be many types of objects. So whenever we are working with rules, we have two important things to interact with. One is the list of available arguments. Every rule that we would write, we would be basing this on the available arguments for that particular rule type. Further, we have the returns on what could be returned from that particular rule. So for example, over here it is identity name. It is identity. So depending on these two arguments and return types, we would be constructing our rules. And further, all this documentation, as we have previously discussed as well, is listed in a central registry as well. That is my rule registry. So all this is listed in a central registry as well. That is my rule registry. This rule registry documents all the different rules that you have in your environment and talks about the input arguments and return types. So for example, over here, this is about account selector rule. It is talking about where this particular rule could be used, and then further taking us through the available arguments. So it is talking about available arguments is context and log, that is the global arguments, and then the different signatures or different arguments that are available. So this is a central registry documenting all your rules in your environment. Further, we also talked about a rules XML that is available. So if you go to your IAQ implementation, we also talked about a rules XML that is available. So when I go to web INF, I'm going to config. Over here, you also have example rules available. Now this example rules documents different types of rules. For example, I want to see a customization rule. So it will give me a customization rule. What is listed in a customization rule in this case? So this example checks the accounts group list. And if the account is a admin group, it is adding this particular flag. So I could see over here what are the available arguments, context to query for a sale point database. I could see over here, this is the resource object, application connector. So I could see the available arguments over here, and I could see over here the sample rule. So which means these are two important guides that could help you with your rule execution when you are developing new rules. One is the rules example.xml, and second is your rule registry, which documents different rules in your environment, signatures of different rules. Rules can set values directly or perform other actions. Rule registry documents each type of rules and its signature. So either I could open the rule registry from debug page, or I could also get it from IQ console. And this is the command for getting it from IQ console, get rule registry. So what is rule registry? Will drive your rule creation. It will contain the type of the rule, it will contain what all arguments are available, the return types, and the description of the rule. All are documented in this central registry. So when you go to your XML, rule XML over here, so when I open my rule XML over here, so this is my rule XML. So what all I will find in my rule XML? So these are rule name and rule type that is provided by the developer. So rule name over here would be provided by the developer over here. Rule type over here will determine what all, where in the execution this rule will be called and where it could be mapped. Then we have input standard to all rules, input specific to this particular rule. So input specific to all rules will contain context and log. And then we have input specific to this rule. And then under your source, we will have our bean shell or the rule script that we want to be executed. So if I look at my rule XML, I would be able to see my global objects available, arguments available to all rules. I will be able to see specific arguments available to this particular rule, which in this case is environment, type is map. And then further under source, I would be able to see the logic that we are implementing. So this is how rules look like in XML. So this is provided by Identity IQ. This is the metadata created, ID modified, provided by Identity IQ. These are the things provided by developer. That is the rule name and the source code. Remainder is auto-populated by rule editor or provided by developer. So when you're implementing rules, how would you start implementing rules over here? So first of all, you have to learn about Identity IQ objects. So this is one of the primary things that you should understand. Identity IQ objects. Now, what are these Identity IQ objects? Now, whenever I take you through a particular module, I always talk about the debug page or what is that object called. For example, we have identity object. We have application object. So in application, we talked about links. Similarly, we have for roles, we have bundles. So understanding this object model is very important. Then only you will be able to interact with SailPoint API. So understanding which object gives you what information is available under a particular object, how these objects are linked is very critical to your implementation. So for this, I have kept a particular guide that could further. So as we go ahead and talk about different modules, I will be introducing you to different objects, but a guide is also available, that is object modeling guide, and that I've kept in my advanced documentation that you could go through. And this object modeling guide is the identity IQ object model. So let me show you this particular guide. So this is identity IQ object model. It talks about what different objects are available. So when I talk about identity object, so what I could get from link, what I could get from bundle. So all these objects are linked, and now you could look at that what all you could get from identity object. So understanding this object model is important. You could get all the details over here. So for example, what does identity object contains? Identity object contains these attributes. So for example, object config, links. So link is the list of link objects, detected roles, assigned roles, exceptions, manager value. So you should understand that which object can give you what. For example, I'm talking about identity object, and I could say that what all identity object can give me, what all I could get from my identity object. Similarly, for other object types, this object model is being made where I could see which object is giving me what over here. So in this case, I can see over here that this particular is giving me assigner, date, source. Similarly, for different object types, what I could get from identity, entitlement, so all these is listed. Now this API documentation or the object model is constantly changing. It is constantly changing. You could see over here it has been revised multiple times. It has updated for 7.3. Now you also have this available. So this variable available, which could also give you what are the available variables available in this particular object type. So for example, this is an example of that. So over here, I'm leveraging this to print what all available values variables I have in this particular object type. So this could also be used because this API documentation is constantly changing. So understanding this object model is important, but if you would like what a list of what attributes are being supported under a particular object, you could also leverage this. So this could also be leveraged, and this dot variables would list you. This bean shell has a this dot variable array that we can access, and this could list down all the variables that you could access from a particular object type. So this could also be used. But understanding this object model is critical to your implementations. I would recommend each one of you to go through this object model documentation. Okay. Now, the second important thing is after you understand identity IQ object model, the second important thing that you should understand is you should remember what arguments are available and what are the return types, because these are the things that you would be working with, arguments and returns. So arguments and returns are available when you open any editor. These arguments and return types are listed for every rule that you are writing. So general strategy is figure out what you have to work with, that is your input variables, and figure out what we need to return from signature. So, and we have to use API calls to get from A to B. Now the next important thing over here is, so now this return arguments and return types as it is available in rule editor or rule registry. So you could use the rule editor that is provided that lists down all the arguments or return types. Apart from that, rule registry is also used, which documents all your rules. The third important thing to this is you should be able to understand your API documentation. Now API documentation lists down all the classes, all the packages available, all the methods. So to interact with your SailPoint API, you should also understand how you could read the API documentation. So see, when you're writing rules, the first thing is understanding different objects. From which object, what variables are provided. This is the primary thing. You should understand which object is providing which variables, meaning when you refer to a particular object, what all information you can get from that object. So understanding the object model is the first thing. Second is, for a particular rule type, you should understand the arguments and return types that are listed in your rule editor and rule registry. The third thing is you should understand how to read API documentation. So let us go to the API documentation and briefly understand what all is available in my API documentation. So SailPoint API documentation lists down basic object model for identities, accounts, entitlements, roles, and more. You will have SailPoint context available for searching for objects. You have query options and filters to go for filtering, filtered results. You can modify and save objects. So this is the basic object model that we have seen in that documentation. So it is talking about that if I open an identity object, what all I would be able to get. So account link will give me the list of application accounts and what all is available under that. Then further under entitlement, I will get my managed attribute, meaning what permissions the user is holding on my target application. Similarly, I can get my role information. We have not discussed about roles in details, but I could get my assigned and detected roles. Similarly, my other object models. So as we go ahead, we'll discuss these as well. When we'll discuss about roles and certifications, we'll come back and discuss about these object models. But one thing that you can understand from this is that every object in SailPoint is interlinked. For example, whenever you create a particular object over here, you have a lot of interlinked information that is of different objects in your environment. So you could see that certification in this case, one object is linked to another object is linked to another object. So you should understand that what is the master or mother object from which what all child objects you're getting, what all variable information you're getting. So that is what you will get in your API in your first document, that is your identity IQ object model. Now reading this object model is critical. So Java doc lays out the most common areas of SailPoint object model. So when you open your documentation, for example, I'm going to localhost identity IQ. To open this API documentation, over here you have to write doc/java doc. This will open your API documentation. So this lays out the most common areas of SailPoint object model. The first is SailPoint API. The first important is SailPoint API. So this is the SailPoint API package which contains SailPoint context and emailer. So when I go over here, when I click on SailPoint API, over here is my SailPoint context and email notifier. Now SailPoint context over here, this is the context that is talking to my relational database, querying for different objects. So over here, different methods are available. As I mentioned earlier, so I have get objects available. So I could see the methods inherited from my interface, that is SailPoint API Persistence Manager. So I have get object by ID, get object by name, get objects, search. So these are the methods available by which I could get different objects in my environment over here. So this is SailPoint API package. And SailPoint context, as we are talking about, context is most important because using which I would be able to interact with SailPoint database. Then we have SailPoint connector. So for different types of connectors, what is the support provided is listed in this second important package, that is SailPoint connector over here. So when I go to SailPoint connector, I could see what is available for, say, JDBC connector over here. So I could see what all methods, fields are available for JDBC connector. and then I could work with those available methods over here. So support is provided for your different connectors like delimited file connector, JDBC connector, custom connector that you might be writing for that. We have open connector framework. So this is SailPoint connector package. Then this is the most important package for SailPoint object. So as I mentioned, you have different SailPoint objects available like identity, role, link, application, managed attribute is nothing but entitlement. So for different SailPoint objects, what is the support available is available in this particular package. So when I open SailPoint object, these are the different SailPoint objects available. So for example, I want to see what all is available in my identity. I could go to identity over here and I could see what all is available in my identity. Similarly, for different object types, I would be able to see what all is available in that specific object types. So I have specific classes available. So you could see this is identity. So I could see for identity over here what all is available. So this is for my identity. I could see the core class representing my identity cube. I could go down and look at what all is available in my identity classes. So I could see identity classes, available return types, and then we make these API calls. How do we make these API calls? By understanding this API documentation. So whenever I'm working with a particular object, that particular object class is available over here. So I could see for that particular class, what is the support provided, what are the methods provided over here for everything. For example, I'm working with roles now. So roles are called bundles. So I could see in bundles what all methods are available. So I could see methods over here, what all methods are available, and then I could leverage these methods to interact with my API. So this is what is the general strategy. You have your arguments, you have your return types, and you have these API calls to link your arguments and return types. So SailPoint object over here, this is the package listing different SailPoint objects for which we have listed classes that list down different methods available to interact with these objects. Similarly, you have this package available for SailPoint task and for SailPoint tools. That is utility methods, lots of utility methods for SailPoint development. So I have for SailPoint utility as well. So this is for SailPoint utility. So starting point over here for using SailPoint API, passed into rules, task, and workflow steps, provide mechanism for determining different things like current logged in user, getting system configuration, sending an email, and so on. So once we are working with the rule, we have the available arguments and return types. These API calls can be made to interact with SailPoint API. So let us look at some of the basics over here. Now finding a single object. When we are finding a single object, we can again, I can leverage context and I could leverage get object by name and get object by ID. So I will go back. I will go to my SailPoint API over here. I will go to SailPoint context, and over here I will go to methods. There are methods that are available. And over here in sale point context, we have the methods available to get objects. So I have get object by ID, get object by name. If I go for get object by ID, retrieves an object by ID over here. So I am leveraging this. Similarly, I have get object by name. So I could get my relevant object either by ID or by name over here. So finding a single object by a name or ID, example over here, identity user context dot get object by name. So I have to pass the class to which that it belongs. Which class it belongs to? Identity class. So I'm passing identity dot class, identity name, and I'm returning user dot get manager. So over here we are we are using get object by name, in which we are passing the class to which it belongs and the identity name, and we are getting the users manager, user dot get manager over here. So given an identity name, we are getting their manager details. Similarly, we could also use get object by ID. In get object by ID, again I am using context. So context is for interacting with my SailPoint database. Now I'm saying get object by ID. Now the class is not identity, the class is application class. So I'm saying application dot class and passing my ID. What is this ID? Whenever we create any object in our environment, it is assigned a unique ID. So when I open application over here, when I open application, so this application is assigned a unique ID. So every object is assigned. So this is the ID over here. So using by passing this ID as well, that is stored in my application XML or any object XML, again I can interact with my API over here. So this time we're using get object by ID, application.class, and returning application.getName. So for finding a single object, we can use get object by name, class, comma name, class like identity class or application class, and the name or the ID. To find multiple objects, we can use get objects, class, and query options. So what is query options over here? Query options allows us to filter the results. Filtering of the results is very important. So rather than getting everything, we could also create filters using query options. So in this case, I'm getting all the rules using context get objects rule.class. So over here, we have get objects. So over here, we have get objects, and it is giving me return all objects of a given class. It can be constrained by query options. So over here, what I'm doing over here, I'm doing list rules context.get objects rule.class returns. So get objects returns a Java list. It is giving me a Java list over here of all the rules in this case. So I'm getting all the rules. Now let's say I want to get all the rules of a specific type of type build map, then we can use this query options. So for filtering my results, so filter constrained by filters in query options. So in this case, what we are doing, we are adding filter qo.add filter, filter dot equals type is equal to build map. So query options allows us for filtering of the results. So finding multiple objects, we could use get objects, and for creating filtered query, we could use query options. So similar case we were doing over here as well. So when I'm executing this particular rule, report uncorrelated identities, in this case, we are using our filters. So in this case, the filter was, I was filtering on correlated equal to false, and then we are printing the name of the identity is user.getName, for which our correlation is failing, and this was inside a try block, and we have a catch block to catch for exceptions if any. So query options allows us for filtering of the results. Now we also have search available in context. So we also have search available over here. So in this case, which one we should prefer? We should prefer search or we should prefer get objects. So returns a set of objects matching the query options. Although this returns an iterator, implementations are actually fetching the objects into memory to use this option with care. So the advantage over here is with search also we could fetch multiple objects. We could also use search to find multiple objects. And with search, we could also make a projection query. So when we introduce query options in that, that becomes a projection query. When we are doing it with search, it becomes a projection query. Now search is preferred over get objects because search returns a database cursor. So the best practice is use search with properties wherever possible versus get objects, because search returns a database cursor, whereas get objects returns a list of objects. Now you could use both search as well as get objects to interact with your database, but using search is recommended. And when you use search with query options, this is called a projection query, that is projecting for a filtered search. So for a more optimized search, use query options. So like in this case, I'm getting all identities that are uncorrelated and I'm adding a filter correlated boolean equal to false. This is the filter we are adding. So search returns a Java iterator in this case. When we are using context.search, we are not using over here get objects. We are using context.search. It returns a Java iterator. Projection search will return me a array of object strings. So when we are doing in this case with introducing query options further and the properties, so in this case, in add filter over here, correlated boolean false, and over here I'm also adding name. So this name is the properties. So this type of the search will now become a projection query, and this projection query is further used for optimization. So what are some of the best practices over here? Ensure cursors are not left open. Like you could use util.flush iterator. So look for a specific account, break the loop when found. So in this case, what I'm using util.flush iterator. And again, query options to filter out the results, and context.search rather than using get objects. For saving objects, we could use save object over here. So generally it is not required. Many rules do not require you saving the objects that are returned from the rule. It is auto provided, but we could use save objects over here. So context dot save object and context dot commit transaction. So this is the best practice. You search with properties wherever possible versus get objects. Search returns a database cursors, whereas get objects returns a list of objects. Perform filtering using query options instead of querying for all objects. So like in our earlier case, we were getting all objects using get objects. So the recommended approach is using query options or using search instead of get objects. Performing filtering using querying option instead of querying of all objects. When iterating over large volume of objects, use a projection query to pull in the IDs only. Use get object by ID to get individual object. And occasionally you could use context.dcache. Perhaps every 100 objects it is recommended to use context.dcache. Okay, what is projection query? As I said, what is projection query over here? So projection query is when you are using a search with the class. So for example, in this case, I'm providing a class, identity.class. I'm using query options as well, and I'm also providing a properties over here. So this will become a projection query. So get the name only for each correlated identity. I don't want to pull in all my details. I'm specifying a projection. I'm providing a projection query where I'm specifying which particular property I would like to fetch. So that becomes a projection query. So that becomes a projection query in this case. So the context object, as I was talking about, is passed into Bean shell scripts in Identity IQ. It maintains an open connection to the relational database. So Identity IQ uses this Hibernate ORM package to manage querying for objects in the backend database. So learning how to query over here using these query options, filters that we talked about. So this is going to be helpful whenever we are interacting with our API. So in short, when you're working with rules, these are the three important things. You should understand what are relevant objects, what are arguments and return types available, and then you should understand your API documentation, how you could use the different methods provided over here to query for different objects, interact with SailPoint API for that specific object. So for every object, we have a class available like identity class, application class, bundle class, so that we have to work our way through whenever we are interacting with rules. And some of the best practices I've already talked about that use projection queries, use your whenever possible use search instead of get objects, and you can further go for creating these query options, filtering your queries over here as you are interacting with SailPoint API. Okay, some of the questions on the chat window. How do we provide sequencing for multiple rules in a task? So sequencing of multiple rules in a task, you could create multiple run rule task in that case and schedule it using sequential task launcher. So if you have to do that, you could create multiple run rule task. So this run rule task will create your templates. So create multiple run rule task and then schedule it using sequential task launcher. So that would execute your rules in a particular sequence, whatever sequence you want, and the rules would be mapped inside your particular task. If I'm writing a rule using a rule editor, is there a way to debug the code? Yes, you have a way, and this way is the log object that we talked about. So log object can be used for logging, and so this could be used over here for logging. Let me show you that. So whenever we are creating rules, you could use the built-in log4j object for logging, control via your config file. So in this case, what we are doing, we are performing custom logging per rule. So like in this case, what I'm doing is I'm creating a logger in my rule. So I could again turn on and off by registering this logger in my log4j properties file, and I could include it in my trace statement. So in this case, rather than using your sysout statements, you could use this log object. And for using this log object, what you have to do, let me show that to you. So this is Apache Log4j, and so these are the two Log4j libraries that you could import in your code. And then over here, you could control the logging in your bean shell over here. So whatever bean shell that you're writing, you could control the logging over here depending on which level that you want to log. You could write these log statements and create a logger object like we have created it over here, and then control your log level, whatever log level that you want to do. Register this particular logger back into your log4j properties file. So you have to register this back in your log4j properties file like it is done over here, and then control the logging from that central logging configuration. So any rule you could provide logging by creating a logger object, and this log and context are provided everywhere. So even while using editor, you could introduce these log statements. It is recommended that these log statements are included in every rule that you write. Okay. Yeah, same process metrics that we talked about earlier can be applied over here, and you could create a meter over here. So for those of you who are new to coding, how you could start with implementing of these rules, because as we talked about how you have to start. So first of all, you have to read this object modeling guide that I talked about. So you should focus on reading this particular guide. So this will give you information about what all different objects are available. This is point one that I want each one of you to do. So read this object modeling guide. Again, it will make more sense when we will discuss more and more modules, like about policy module, risk module. As I go ahead, I will introduce you to more and more sale point objects, but understanding this guide is important. As I mentioned earlier, you could also use this variable to list down all the variables that are listed, because the API documentation is constantly changing. So this could also be used to list down the variables being passed on to the bean shell namespace. So first thing that you have to do is understand this object model. Second thing is, whenever you're working with any rules, these arguments and return types are available. So you will always work with those arguments and return types. The third thing is the API documentation that we talked about. So whenever you're working with API documentation, it is quite simple to understand. Open your API documentation. If you're working with SailPoint API context, look at SailPoint context, look at the different methods available, and which method that you want to leverage to get what. I want to get username, so look at what get username can get you over here. It will return the name of the current user of this context. Similarly, if I'm working with a particular SailPoint object, go to your SailPoint object, which object you're working with, open that particular object. For example, I'm working with, let's say, application object. So I could see in application object what methods are available. So these are the calls that you are going to do. So I could go over here, I could look at my available methods. I could also look at depreciated methods that are no longer supported. So over here, I could look at what are the supported methods and then work with those methods to interact with my API. So for example, get account schema, get attributes over here, application attributes. So when I look at attributes over here, so I have get attributes and set attributes. So a map of the attributes that describe the application configuration. So whenever I'm writing rules, I'm always working with these arguments, returns available from a particular rule type, and these methods that I use for a particular object to interact with my API. So those of you who are new to this will also find this Bean Shell guide that is provided in this Bean Shell manual. So as I mentioned, it is lightweight scripting language. So I'm pasting the link over here. If or you could simply write bean shell in your Google, and this is Java scripting. So the difference over here is it is lightweight and it is called loosely scoped. When I say loosely scoped, things like declaration over here are not required. Even without declaration, you could use your variables over here. Now, for example, over here, look at the standard Java syntax over here. And this is loosely typed Java syntax, which over here can be used in your bean shell. So even without declaration, you could have loose or dynamically typed variables. This is supported in bean shell. So since bean shell is lightweight scripting language, whatever that you do in Java is possible in bean shell as well. But in this case, it supports loosely or dynamically typed variables over here. So over here, for example, I was defining my variable types, but in this case, in loosely typed Java syntax over here, we am directly using over here. So directly at the runtime, they could be further handled. So this is one guide that you will find helpful. SailPoint also gives us this bean shell implementation guide, which I have again kept in the drive. So apart from, so one is the bean shell development guide. That is available for you. So this is again provided by the SailPoint vendor. So how you could leverage SailPoint bean shell, this is provided. Where I've kept it on the drive. So I've kept it on the drive. Those of you who have access to Compass, so those of you who have access to Compass can look at the Compass documentation for bean shell guide. So this is the bean shell implementation guide, developer guide. So this talks about all the important things over here to interact with API. Some of the things that we discussed as well, like using get objects, leveraging search, leveraging log4j, a simple program like a hello world test framework. So all those is listed. So those of you who are new to coding can use this to start interacting with API. So for example, over here, a sysout statement is being leveraged as a basic program. Further, it will go more about using your filters, using iterators. All that is listed. So this bean shell implementation guide as a best practice. So one is this. One is the original bean shell documentation. So when you go ahead and the documentation is also provided by bean shell over here. So this is beanshell.org, where you could go ahead and understand the basics of bean shell. So this is also provided. Again, a link to that I have provided already. So this is the important guide that is provided by SailPoint. This is the bean shell scripting guide that is provided by the creators of bean shell. And then apart from that, you should work with your rule registry. So always when you're working, you should look at the rule registry, the rule examples that we talked about, whenever configuring a particular type of rule. So for example, today I'm working with a correlation rule. I started working with a correlation rule. I can look at example of correlation rule in this documentation. The rule example rules that I talked about. So for example, over here, I'm looking at correlation over here. I'm searching for correlation in this example rules.xml. So this will give you a fair idea of what you can work with. So for example, this is a correlation rule that is giving the relevant description of the rule, the relevant arguments that you could avail, that you could work with. And finally, an example of the rule over here. So this is a scoping rule. So it is talking about scopes. So similarly, for any rule that you have to create, For any rule that you're working with, these examples are provided. So for example, this is for creation rule, identity creation rule. I could see what this particular rule is being used for. I could go ahead and look at the available signature. Remember, we always work with the signature, like the argument types, context, environment, application, account, identity. So these are the available arguments. And then it also gives you a sample rule that you could use and modify it according to your implementation. So general practice is learn those input arguments and return types, learn how to interact with your SailPoint API, that is looking at the specific class that you're working with and the methods available. Then use those constructs that we talked about, like get object by ID or search or projection queries, create filters to iterate over your objects and get your relevant data into SailPoint and modify that. You have get and set statements available. So all these guides are available, and if you're accessing it using the drive, I will tell you where it is available in the drive as well. So in drive, it is available under advanced documentation. If you don't have access to Compass, so you could start with your advanced documentation. So as assignment, I want all of you to write a rule to decrypt the passwords that we have written. So you have to write a rule to decrypt the passwords, and again, it is available in context. So you have to write a rule to decrypt. So that is your assignment you can consider, and that is what you will have to do. So whatever the password that is set on identities, as you know that password is available, encrypted password is available on identities. So leverage your decrypt method that is provided to decrypt your passwords. So write a rule for that. So if I go to our SailPoint documents, go to your advanced documentation over here, SailPoint advanced documentation. So all that bean shell guide I was talking about is also placed over here in this bean shell folder. So this is available in this bean shell folder as well for different XMLs, different PDF that are provided over here, right from Hello World. So you could use that as well. So start writing. So whenever you're working with your exercises, all your sample rules are already provided in your VM. So do not leverage, do not use these rules initially. First try writing rules on your by yourself. So look at what are the available arguments, what are the return types, look at your API documentation. So start to write rules by yourself. You might get stuck for the first or the second time, but once you get hang of it, you will be able to configure these rules. Do not start directly using the rules provided in your SailPoint VM. So start writing rules by yourself, and if you get stuck anywhere, let me know, then I could help you out. Any other questions, anyone?